First off, thank you so much for the invitation to be here and to be back. It's so lovely to see so many wonderful and familiar faces. I spent the 2016 and 17 and I think maybe 18 academic years here. And so I was here very recently. Brown holds a very, very special place in my heart, especially the Watson Institute and the Middle East Studies Center. And this is where I wrote my book. So it's kind of like coming back full circle and in many ways coming back home. So thank you for welcoming me here and having me here. So starting in May of 2018, when President Trump pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal and he initiated his administration's so-called maximum pressure policy, a number of developments have rapidly taken place, especially over the past few months, but very recently over the past few weeks that have sort of led us to the brink of war. Including the assassination of General Soleimani in Iraq, and then millions of Iranians pouring out into the streets for his funeral across Iran, the downing of an Iranian the Iranian retaliation strikes against the U.S. military, as well as the downing of a passenger plane in Iran that killed all 178 passengers on board, which then renewed new strikes and protests in Iran against the Iranian state. So how do we make sense of all of these? My research in Iran ended well before this current crisis. However, the tensions between Iran and the U.S. obviously do not start with Trump. They go way back to 1979, and as you will learn tomorrow, hopefully if you come to the screening of coup 53, they actually start before that in 1953 with the CIA coup against the Mossadegh's government in Iran. But my research among the Revolutionary Guard in Iran, especially among the media team, including General Soleimani's media team, can help us better understand, I hope, what's going on in Iran beyond the often simplistic takes in mainstream media. The IRGC, or the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, is not just a military entity in Iran. And there are very real dynamics and politics that play in the country, even within the regime itself, which is often treated as a black box by Western observers. So let's dig in. My hope for the talk today is to really sort of move beyond the headlines, as I have in the title, to sort of get a better sense of who the IRGC is, who are the men who occupy this space, and more importantly, what are the bigger dynamics at play in Iranian society since the 1979 revolution. So I was sitting at a production meeting with a group of commanders of the Revolutionary Guard who were in charge of media production in the country. About 20 minutes into the discussion of the films that they were going to be funding for the year, one of them said to his colleagues, "This youngest generation in our country no longer understands our revolutionary language any longer. We're wasting our time with the things that we make. They don't care about it. That's why so many of them were in the streets protesting against our system last year." Now, what he was referring to was the 2009 Green Movement, which by the time at the meeting that I was speaking at, this had happened 2 years prior to that. And at the time, the 2009 Green Movement was the largest mass demonstrations in Iran since the 1979 revolution. I had joined these men in the Revolutionary Guard in numerous meetings since that 2009 Green Movement. In each, they contemplated what had inspired so many young Iranians to come out onto the streets in the numbers that they had. The demonstrators went from "Where is my vote?" to "Down with the dictator." The slogans of the 2009 protests were almost identical to the slogans of the 1979 revolution, in which many of the men in the Revolutionary Guard, especially the sort of higher echelons, remember taking place themselves as when they were teenagers and in their early 20s. In that same meeting, one commander of the Revolutionary Guard, whose wife and kids had been a part of this Green Movement protest, said, "These kids don't care about the revolutionary stories we've told them the past 30 years, and that's our fault. We can't blame them. We haven't properly communicated our stories to them. We need to bring them back to our side by telling them better stories." Now, what does it mean to have the commanders of Iran's most powerful military apparatus, the very force in charge of defending the revolution, admit that the majority of the population no longer understands the regime's religious or revolutionary language? So the book that I ended up writing that came out of this research sort of starts with the classic paradox of any successful revolutionary movement. Namely, how does the commitment to a revolutionary project get transmitted from one generation to the next as historical circumstances change? Or in other words, how does a revolutionary movement that has become successful, become a state entity, how do they keep younger generations sort of tied into their ideology once they've become the status quo without simultaneously having these younger generations rise up in another movement against them? So to answer this, I did field work over a 10-year period in Iran with the Basij paramilitary organization and the Revolutionary Guard, media and cultural producers, to understand how they envision the future of the Islamic Republic as it enters its 5th decade. What can we gain from understanding the Islamic Republic with those charged with communicating what the regime stands for? I started my research thinking that most of my time would be spent with these media makers as they thought about movies and media products to sort of get the attention and bring back into the fold those who had been protesting against the system. And while there was a lot of that, the discussions behind closed doors focused much more around heated debates among the different generations of the Revolutionary Guard and Basij, particularly between the first generation, meaning those who had fought in the Iran-Iraq War and who are now at sort of the commanders of these forces, and the third generation, those who came of age after the revolution, who are now in their late 20s and early 30s. So a big part of this research is looking deeply at generational changes in revolutionary systems. And this is very key to beginning to understand the politics of what is going to be and is happening right now in Iran. A revolutionary state has the dual project of appealing to citizens while simultaneously defining what the revolutionary project will mean over the long term. How to achieve this goal without losing the revolution altogether is a contentious question. Now, there's been a wealth of scholarship on areas of resistance to the post-revolutionary Iranian state. But our understanding of the Islamic Republic remains two-dimensional, and our notions of those who make up Iran's armed and paramilitary forces are caricatures. By shining an ethnographic lens on media producers of the Islamic Republic, I found a state, much like any state project the world over, including this one, that is in the constant process of becoming. The concerns of the men who helped create the Islamic Republic's vast media output are not confined to religion and Islamic politics. Rather, they tended to focus on class, generational differences, and social mobility. So as much as this book is about new media strategies, it's also about deeper social phenomenon. And it's those deeper social phenomenon that I want to talk about here today. Those who have viewed Iran's politics in the past 40 years solely through the lens of Islam have overlooked important social dynamics that undergird the system. My findings led me to question not only existing depictions of these men, but more generally the predominant frame of analysis when it comes to understanding the Islamic Republic. Since 1979, when revolution swept through a country that just 1 year before President Jimmy Carter was standing in Tehran toasting as an island of stability, American policymakers have scrambled to understand an upheaval that not only blindsided them, but that expressed a deeply felt anti-imperialism as Iranians demanded independence from Washington. U.S. news media at the time described Iranian society as, quote, possessed by madness, and Iranians as blinded by a religious fervor and seeking martyrdom at all costs. Such explanations may have answered an immediate need to understand on simple terms and eventually to undermine the revolutionary government and the aging Ayatollah at its helm. In essence, it's had the effect over the past 40 years because these lines and this narrative has been repeated so often that it has rendered the Iranian state as irrational. But this framework, unfortunately, has not evolved much in 40 years. And more importantly, it's left us ill-equipped to understand the Islamic Republic today. What happens, I ask, if we reframe our study of Iran from the vantage point of the supporters of the Islamic Republic? If scholarly and public culture analysis has failed to understand the supporters of the Islamic Republic in all of their complexities the past 40 years, what happens if we take a different approach to studying contemporary power in Iran? one that insists, as anthropology demands, on an actual curiosity about the positions and worldviews of the Islamic Republic on their terms. Now, a bit of a quick background for those who may not know. So Iran has a bifurcated military apparatus, which means that there was the formal Artish, the military, that existed prior to the 1979 revolution. When Ayatollah Khomeini eventually came to power in Iran, he feared, after the revolution, he feared that the Artish could potentially stage a coup against him and against this new revolutionary government. So he created the Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. And the mission of the IRGC in the beginning was meant to be a force to defend the revolution from within, against possible coups, against another possible U.S. orchestrated coup, for example, which is one of the reasons that they ended up taking the U.S. embassy in November of 1979. But in the first year and a half after the revolution took place, essentially the IRGC, what becomes the IRGC, they were deployed to areas that were having armed uprisings against the new revolutionary government, mostly in the Kurdish and Turkoman regions of the country. In September of 1980, Saddam Hussein decides, with some goading by Western powers, to invade Iran in the south. And he thought that this would be a very quick war. It ends up being an 8-year war. Now, the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s tends to be forgotten outside of Iran or Iraq. But I think it's incredibly key to understanding the geopolitics of the Middle East to this day, because that war ended up fundamentally changing the geopolitics of the region. The Iran-Iraq War is known as the longest conventional war of the 20th century. Chemical weapons were used for the first time since World War I. This was a war in which it's not like drone warfare of today. It was a war that was fought in very close proximity, in trench warfare style. And more importantly, this is the war in which those who are now the commanders of Iran's Revolutionary Guard, this is where they began to get their outlook on international politics, because it was on the battlefield of the Iran-Iraq War in which they began to experience how the United States fights proxy warfare. And importantly, by also focusing on the Iran-Iraq War and understanding it, you begin to understand one of the reasons by which the Islamic Republic in 2011 onwards begins to support Syria. Because in the Iran-Iraq War, importantly, every single Arab country began to support Saddam Hussein. The only Arab country that did not was Syria's Assad. This is extremely key to then understanding what happens in the later years that come after that. Now, the Basij paramilitary organization is a paramilitary organization that was created also during the revolutionary period. And during the war, it becomes the main recruitment arm of the Revolutionary Guards in order to fight the war. Because during the war, Iraq was getting very advanced weaponry from the United States, from Western powers. Iran was too, and this is sort of, but much more covertly, and this leads to the Iran-Contra affair. You guys want to understand what's happening today, you really got to go back to the 1980s, at least. But what is really key to understanding this is that what in Iran's calculation, the way that they could fight back against Iraq was not by weaponry, because they didn't have it, but it was through men, through sending, because they had such a larger population than the Iraqis did. So the Basij paramilitary organization becomes key to this, because it becomes the sort of conduit through which they begin to send forces to the front lines to fight this war. I'm going to get back to why these two organizations are so important. Now, Ayatollah Khomeini, before he passed away in 1989, wrote in his will that no military, including the IRGC, should be involved in the politics of the country. But after his death, not only did the Revolutionary Guard become involved in the economic restructuring of the country, because they began to receive a lot of contracts to rebuild the country after the war was over. So in that way, they begin to amass this incredible economic empire that they have today. But slowly, they become involved in the politics of this country as well. Today, this is important to note, 75% of the population in Iran is under the age of 40, meaning that they do not remember the revolution or the war, the two foundational moments of the Islamic Republic. Now, for those who are social scientists in the room, you know how important foundational stories are to state projects. and to students in the room. One great example that's happening today is looking at all the controversy that the New York Times 1619 Project has caused among certain circles, to understand what happens when you begin to toy with foundational stories and how important they are to state narratives. Now, Masoud Dehnamaki, who's the man in the middle with the megaphone, he's the founder of Ansar Hezbollah in Iran, which is a paramilitary organization in the country. And he's turned into one of the most commercially successful filmmakers in the country today. This was a big surprise when it happened, because prior to him turning to filmmaking, as the leader of Ansar Hezbollah, he was actually in charge of suppressing the first massive uprising against the Islamic Republic, which was in 1999 by the students at the University of Tehran. When that uprising happened, he was in charge of raiding the student dormitories and really beating and taking away many of the students who had been protesting then. So he eventually comes out and he begins making movies in the early 2000s. And he said in an interview, during the Iran-Iraq War, we had to shed blood for the revolution, and we did. Later, we believed we should publish journals and books for the revolution, and we did. Today, we think cinema best expresses our goals, so we make movies. But Dehnamaki is not only talking about technique, he's speaking of a wholesale shift in emphasis. For him and for those in his cohort, the quest to make revolutionary subjects was a struggle to be waged in visual media. So he made a film in 2007 called The Outcasts, and this broke all box office records in Iran at the time. It was a comedy about the war, and this was at a time when no one was watching war films any longer in Iran. So I began to follow him, and because I found it really intriguing what he was doing. And at the time, he had a blog on the internet, and he was writing in his blog that he wanted to start teaching younger Basijis and younger members of the paramilitary groups how to make entertaining films in order to bring new audiences in to what the Islamic Republic should be. And so that's when I decided I wanted to do this project and to go and look at these film collectives that they were building and what were these new stories that they were trying to tell. Dehnamaki represents a shift away from the blunt propaganda of the first 2 decades of the revolution to creating new entertainment to attract younger audiences. Now, first off, every government creates propaganda. Some are just much more savvy at it than others. And second, national militaries can be intimately involved with media production. A prominent example that scholars have long looked at is the very intimate relationship between the US military and Hollywood studios. There are more recent studies out now that look at the ways in which the Israeli and Colombian militaries, for example, are also active media producers. In the study of revolutionary governments, scholars have long looked at the Soviet, Chinese, and Cuban cases, for example. And while there's much great scholarship on media production in Iran, one gap remains the media produced by the state, which spends the most money on media production in the country. Now, given how long it took me to gain access, and this is where I'm going to start talking a little bit about the type of research that I did for you all to be able to sort of glean where some of this data is coming from. Given how inhospitable a place Iran can be for long-term social scientific research, it's not surprising that we don't have more ethnographic research that sort of looks at different parts of the state in Iran. As an anthropologist, I sought to do long-term research. I knew I didn't want to just rely on interviews because, like state elites the world over, they would only give me formulaic answers and sort of stay on their message. I wanted to know about their work, and I wanted to also obviously understand the Revolutionary Guard, but I knew if I went in and I said I want to understand about the Revolutionary Guard, they would either put me in prison or say, get the hell out of my face. Media was a very important sort of point for me to focus in on because it was there that they are communicating what they want the regime or what they want the project to stand for to the more general audiences. And also, importantly, they don't see that as being political work. And so this was a way for me to be able to gain that sort of access. But more importantly, I wanted to see them as they sort of worked on these projects over a long period of time, not just interview them and see their final products, but understand why were they casting certain actors over others. Why were they working with certain directors? What stories were they trying to tell? And sort of, and where was the money coming from, very importantly. Now, I had been working on these issues overall for about 10 years when I began the research, first in relation to survivors of chemical warfare in Iran. I directed an oral history project of chemical warfare survivors and also a documentary film, The Skin That Burns. And I'm telling you all of this because it was only because of these experiences that I was able to later get my foot in the door with the IRGC and the Basij paramilitary organizations. In my earlier work with veterans, I got to know the main doctors and veterans involved in the care of the war wounded, and I showed them that I could be respectful of their worldview and empathetic to them as human beings, even if I disagreed with them. Once I had decided on this research, I mentioned it to these doctors who had been war veterans themselves, and it was only through their introduction to their friends in their media world and them saying that they knew me and that I had been working on these issues for so long that I was able to get my foot in the door in the media world, and then had to show up constantly for another 2 years to be granted access into that world. Coming from what the regime considers a counter-revolutionary background, with parents tied to the leftist movements of the revolution in Iran, as well as, on my mother's side of the family, high-ranking members in the Shah's government and Mossadegh's government, and as an Iranian American, which we know that the state sees as potential spies, it took another few years of constantly being there to convince them to trust me. I knew my social media presence, my writings, and even my cell phone conversations in Iran were being monitored during this phase. Over time, I was granted full access, but I knew full well that the doors could shut on me at any moment. Yet what I did not expect was the degree to which the US government would attempt to curtail my academic freedom because I was doing work and research in a sanctioned country and because I'm a dual national. My university ended up spending tens of thousands of dollars on legal fees for me to be able to even do this research, something that most universities would not be willing to do. And they hired a big DC law firm to defend my right to do this research. In addition, as an Iranian American, my loyalties were constantly questioned by the US government. At one point, I was even asked by university officials if I was sort of working for both sides. And as we know, dual nationals are often the targets of aggressive foreign policy, from Japanese Americans in World War II to Muslim Americans after 9/11. And as I write in an academic piece that just came out in December, being a researcher that's seen as a national security threat is not just the domain of authoritarian governments over there, but very much the domain of our government right here. And this was during the Obama administration, so pre-Trump. It's not all just Trumpian politics. Nonetheless, I stood out in that environment because I was the only female. Even though I had spent a decade prior to this research living in Iran, there is no way that I could blend into this crowd. Not only is the world of the Revolutionary Guard and the Basij masculine, but the media world is especially masculinized. Now, this is different from the non-regime media world in Iran. Actually, Iran boasts one of the highest rates of women film directors in the world. But this world is different than that, and I'm happy to talk about the gender dynamics of it during Q&A if anyone is interested. Methodologically, I ended up sort of spending much time in editing rooms, production meetings, funding meetings, and both traveling inside and outside of the country to get a sense of how they were sort of showing their project to different communities, both domestic ones and international ones. Now, we tend to think of the Revolutionary Guard and the Basij as homogenous groups of men. When the supreme leader gives an order at the top, it's followed down the line. However, what I discovered is men who work in ad hoc ways, who fought over resources, and who disagreed with one another all the time. In other words, they are far from uniform or cohesive. And this is not just in the media realm. I witnessed the same thing in their business realm, and definitely so in their military realm. One of my main interlocutors, who I call Mr. Ahmadi in the book, joined the 2009 Green Movement along with his family. Now, he's a veteran of the war who's had both of his legs blown off by a bomb, and so he's always in a wheelchair and pushed around by usually his son. He and his family look very much pro-regime. Now, what do I mean by that? Because of the way revolutionary citizenship was regulated based on dress in Iran, with the mandatory veil for women as well as certain quotas for dress for men as well, sartorial choices end up mattering in Iran, not just for reasons of fashion per se, but because they signal revolutionary belonging. The friend-enemy divide that's been written about a lot in other revolutionary systems. In Iran, it sort of manifests itself as khodi ghair khodi, meaning us versus them. Now, this becomes really key in understanding the deeper divides that are present in the protests that have erupted in Iran since the downing of the airliner earlier this month. Many of them, students who were at the country's top universities and were going back to their studies abroad for the new semester, they occupy this space of the Ghair Khudi, or the not us, in Iranian society. The education system after the revolution greatly expanded and offered opportunities to many people, but it's also always been the students in the universities that have led the most powerful protest movements against the state, which is why they occupy the space that they do. But even within the Khodis, or those who belong, the situation is extremely complicated. So when Mr. Ahmadi, the man who is in the wheelchair, when he joined the 2009 Green protests in Iran after the protests began, the first 2 days, nothing happened to him and his family. By the third day, when the regime had begun cracking down on these protests, what they began to do first and foremost, actually, was they had charged the Basijis who were cracking down on the protests to go after those who looked like Khodis, who looked like they belonged to the regime. Why? Because if this was supposed to be a revolution, if this was supposed to be a counter-revolutionary movement, then there could not be people who look like they belong to the regime out on the streets of the protests. Also, these forces knew, and Khamenei, the supreme leader, knew, that very large numbers of the Revolutionary Guard's rank and file had been voting for reformist candidates, both in 1997 and in 2009. So if this was supposed to sort of be something that was counter to the regime, they could not have people looking like them out there. So on that day, Mr. Ahmadi gets attacked, and he gets beaten so bad by these Basijis that he gets thrown out of his wheelchair. They have to carry him home, and eventually he gets fired from the cultural center that he had been working in for 20 years prior to that. But he was not dismayed. He believed that he and his cohort had just as much of a legitimate claim over the revolution and its future as its youngest generation. So he ended up opening up his own production studio and started making regime media for freelance, which he believes is the correct type of media to make. Now, by forefronting these issues, I'm able to show how contestation in the Islamic Republic is not just between the regime and the people, or the old generation versus the young generation, as it's often described. Instead, an ethnographic lens on the supporters of the regime allows us to understand how contestation in Iran today involves conflict over the very boundary of what the Islamic Republic is. Now, let me illustrate a bit of this intergenerational divide and what I mean by this. So one afternoon, I was at the Art University in central Tehran, and it's one of the main art universities in the country. And they would hold, this university's Basij student organization would hold these weekly meetings in a room sort of a little bit bigger than this, where they would invite regime filmmakers to come and show their work, and these students would then critique or sort of ask their questions. Now, it's important to note that the university Basij organizations are the most hardline elements on campuses across the country, because they are the ones that are supposed to be monitoring any sort of potential student movement against the government. Now, that day they had invited Mr. Hosseini, who's a very prominent regime filmmaker, but more importantly, a very prominent captain in the Revolutionary Guard in the first 2 decades of the revolution. During the meeting, he told the students in attendance that the regime needed to work on creating projects that were much more inclusive and that would sort of bring in a broader expanse of the population, one that could reach portions of the population that had been protesting against them. The leader of the student Basij organization got up while he was in mid-sentence, pointed his finger at Mr. Hosseini and said, "Your generation may be tired of confrontation, but not ours." When we left, Mr. Hosseini, exacerbated, looked at me and said, "These young Basijis don't understand that distancing ourselves from the general population is what got us into this mess that we now face. We need to reach out to the other side that's protesting against us, not alienate them, as these kids want. You know what their problem is? They don't know what it was like to be marginalized in society. They don't remember because they were born after the revolution. All they've ever known is a system in which our side has been in power." The leaders of the Islamic Republic's armed forces have more at stake today even than the defense of a political system. These men and their families did not command respect in Iranian society before 1979. The monarchy of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi formally marginalized religious families, and the Iranian intellectual elite of the day and of today tends to look down on them. The creation of the Islamic Republic gave pious Iranians of Mr. Hosseini's class and generation a sense of purpose and a place in society. I often heard them wonder aloud anxiously, if circumstances in the country changed, would they be relegated back to the margins of society? This is the central issue at the heart of protecting the Islamic Republic in Iran today amongst its supporters. It's about having a place in society, about counting and not being marginalized. Mr. Hosseini continued to me that day, the younger Basijis don't know that if we don't take care of this revolution, we'll be relegated back to the margins. They don't know how quickly things can change. And again, this is the big difference between the first generation who was alive during the revolution and took part in it, and this third generation who basically grew up in the system that they have, and all they've known is a system where they've been in power. Now, of course, in this endeavor, they've ended up marginalizing whole sectors of the population themselves. And this, in my belief, is the bigger problem at the heart of Iranian political life today. Yet, interestingly, Mr. Hosseini and his colleagues, and this is very key, didn't let their own kids join the Basij paramilitary organization, the very forces that they had joined with such enthusiasm in the 1980s. It would be a step down on the social ladder that they had already scaled. So while this is about maintaining a place in society, deeper social phenomena such as class and social and cultural capital have now led to divisions among the supporters of the Islamic Republic. So who are these younger Basijis and why is there such a divide? I slowly got to know the student leader who stood up in that meeting and who pointed his finger and yelled at Mr. Hosseini. His name is Mustafa. Younger Basijis such as Mustafa feel that the revolution has gone astray because the older generation has lost touch with its values. Like many of his classmates in the University Basij organization, as well as sort of Basij organizations that I met more broadly, Mustafa hails from a pious working class and lower middle class family that migrated to Tehran from smaller towns. When as a teenager, Mustafa wanted to pursue a career in filmmaking, his family couldn't afford the expensive equipment that they needed, and they didn't have a wide social network in the capital. His father, a supporter of the Islamic Republic, encouraged his young son to join the Basij in his high school to see if they could help. One of the mentors in the organization had worked in film and photography before and was able to provide the resources and social network that his family could not. So he eventually ended up going to the art university and graduated with a degree in film. And then most importantly, once he graduated, he was able to get a position as a full-time filmmaker, which also allowed him to provide for his new wife and eventually child and have a middle-class standard of life. The revolution had offered Mustafa and his friends a social mobility to which they saw the corruption of the older generation of revolutionaries as a threat. They're the ones who are soft, not us, he said to me. We appreciate their sacrifices during the war, but they've become corrupted by money and with making themselves like the secular elite. So central to these debates is not only what revolutionary stories to tell, but who can tell them. Who are the rightful heirs to the revolution? It's a question with ever-shifting boundaries in Iran. In the book, I end up offering a range of strategies that they deploy, which I'm not going to go into now, but it goes as far as, for example, to create media. And what's really important here is that they were focusing in the first two decades after the revolution on sort of emulating Soviet revolutionary propaganda. And then they've switched, and now they are looking and studying at Hollywood. Because as I heard over and over again, they would say to me, Hollywood war films are the best kinds of war films, because even if you disagree with the U.S., you watch them and you come out on the side of the U.S. because they know how to tell these stories so well. So they're trying to make new films and new media products that are sort of in that line. And although many of their products fail, some of them end up succeeding. And the work of advertisers or propagandists, for those who study them, know that it's kind of like throwing pasta or spaghetti at a wall. You don't need all of it to stick. In fact, most of it won't stick. But as long as you have two strands that stick, that's sort of you've done your work for the year and you've done good work in that year. Now, interestingly, though, again and again, my conversations with members of the Revolutionary Guard and Basij turned back to issues of corruption, social and cultural class, and generational differences. And because of that, they began to focus so much of their energies on creating stories about nationalism. And this is why General Soleimani's death caused the type of reaction that it did in Iran. Because after the 2009 uprisings that I showed you all photos of, there was a large disagreement within Iranian society against the Revolutionary Guard. And so they decided to reformulate their stories to no longer be about the defense of the Islamic Republic or the defense of Shia politics, but to be about the defense of Iran as a nation. And they began to focus in on Soleimani as the national hero that was keeping the Iranian nation safe from outside forces, especially ISIS. And so this is part of the reason in which Soleimani becomes this huge national figure above and beyond the politics of the regime itself. Yet often my interlocutors turn their anger on one another more than on those who are not supporters of the regime. Their vast and nuanced disagreements revealed a complicated political reality that could not be contained in the familiar binaries that we use to describe Iran today, such as reformists versus hardliners or anti-regime versus pro-regime. In fact, in the aftermath of the nationwide November 2019 protests just a couple of months ago, over increased fuel prices and the subsequent bloody repression by the state, two of my research interlocutors and this youngest generation of the Basijis, who I write a lot about in the book, they made public statements against the decisions of the state to clamp down on the protesters. And this was really interesting for me because they had usually been in favor of much harsher policies from the state towards protesters. But one of them at an awards ceremony just a few days after the clampdown, he came up on stage with his two daughters and he said, "I've been to Syria. We've heard the refrain, be careful not to turn Iran into Syria." It's true, but that refrain has always been directed at the people, at the protesters. It's time now to direct that message to the heads of the state. Be careful not to turn Iran into Syria with your actions. As the Islamic Republic enters its fifth decade, keeping the revolution alive will depend on the ability of its image makers not only to appeal to a younger population that wants change, but also to build consensus among members of the younger generation within the regime's own ranks. The task before the Islamic Republic is to win over a broad cross-section of its citizens while simultaneously defining what shape its revolutionary project and its state apparatus will take over the long term. In this dynamic, how to best achieve this goal without losing the Islamic Republic's founding vision altogether presents a reality in which everything becomes both a possibility and a problem. The men who end up appearing in this book and who I end up doing research with, as well as their families, challenged everything I thought I knew about Iran, revolutions, and states. My research ended up not just being about state media, but about the men who produce this media and what it means ultimately to doubt what they have fought for, not know what is to come, and be wrought with anxiety about the fact that they may be relegated back to the margins of society if their political project fails. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions, and I'm happy to take questions on anything that you all might have questions on.
You have microphones on both sides.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Nadia Ali, and I first want to thank you. I really, really enjoyed your talk. And as an anthropologist, I think it's just really amazing to see how in-depth ethnographic research provides us with a very complex and rich sort of tapestry. But then I'm also really intrigued in terms of how you pulled it off. And I would like you to reflect a little bit more on it in terms of, you said sort of long-term research. So sort of I'm wondering about I assume this involved quite a bit of negotiations, and you reflected a little bit on it. And I'm not even talking about the side here because that's unimaginable what's happening here. But I'm thinking about you also now having published the book, your interlocutors possibly reading the book. How would they react? And clearly they are not a homogeneous they, as you made clear, but what have you already shared your book with some? What are some of the reflections? Do you think, what are your sort of projections in terms of going back? And so I guess also the ethics around doing a research like that, where on the one hand, you know, you feel sort of committed as a researcher to to be able to go back. But then on the other hand, I guess, what were your red lines in terms of sometimes maybe, well, not telling lies, but not totally revealing what you're doing? I mean, as you said, if you would have come out with your research question, lots of people, it would have closed doors. And secondly, I guess, sort of as someone interested in gender studies, I'd like you to reflect a little bit more on the gender dynamics. I mean, these are all men you were talking with. I see lots of intersectionality there in terms of generation, class. So what does, what is the significance of the political developments and the kind of sociological transformations you're describing in terms of changing constructions of what it means to be an ideal man in Iran today?
Thank you for your question. I was completely straightforward about what I was doing when I was in Iran, and I offered my interest in the research as well as what brought me to this research and my own personal background. Before I even let them talk, I came out with that every single meeting, precisely because I knew if I didn't, then that would heighten the chances of them seeing me as a potential spy. Also, I think by being so, what came across to them initially as seeming pretty naive from my end about being so forthright with everything I was trying to do and who I was and what my family background was, also began to break the ice, and we could begin to have conversations. And I write about this in an academic article later, but oftentimes they would test me on my ideas about things or my opinions about things, whether it was Israel-Palestine, whether it was about what the Supreme Leader had just said, things like that, whether it was about whether my family was religious or not. And I began to notice that they were testing me to see if I would tell them the truth, even if they didn't agree with my truth, because then that was an opening for them later to begin to tell me their truths. And so I did not hold back, and I was very honest because I knew the detriments of not being honest. I am getting the book translated into Persian. And I am very, I've sent it to them, but many of them don't read English. So we're getting it translated into Persian, and I want it to be published in Iran. I think it can be. Can I go back? I'm not sure. And I think in current circumstances, when we basically have a war-like situation between the U.S. and Iran, I don't feel comfortable doing so. When I was writing, your question is great, because when I was writing, for 8 months, I didn't even write because I was thinking about those questions for so long. And part of it was that, look, many of the men that I talked to, anytime, for example, especially when I was making my documentary, I realized later, they told me later, that security forces would come to the places where I had been filming and would question the people that I had been filming. And when I found that out, I told them, listen, let's stop filming. And they said to me, they can't dictate what we say. We fought for this country. We have a say in this country. We're not going to let them shut us up. And they kept saying these sorts of things to me. And I realized that for them, it was also really important to have the various voices in these communities that they exist in to be heard, that they also felt very constricted by the attempt by certain parts of the regime to create a monopoly over the narrative. So they also wanted me to write about this. Yet I sort of came back. So it was also not easy doing research with folks that I disagree with and like being around them every single day. And there was a part, I mean, it would have been very easy for me to come back and to write a really racy expose like for the Rolling Stone magazine, right? But that's also not what I was trying to do. What I was actually trying to do was to see things from their point of view as much as possible and understand it from their point of view. And so it took me a while to work through some of the emotions of all the things that I saw that I didn't agree with. And then it took a while for me to sort of get to a point of what are my red lines. And basically what I came down to in writing the book was that I wanted to be fair to my interlocutors and what they told me. And that the things that I did or did not disagree with, I would put in as much historical context as I could. And sort of put out there, they believe this or they say this and this is why. And these are what opposition groups say and this is why. And so it was sort of me trying to do my best in that effort. As far as the changing constructions of ideal masculinity in Iran, I touch upon this quite a bit in the book, and I think one of the things that I found the most fascinating was the ways in which those who had children, how their children began to change them, but more importantly, those who had daughters. And this is where then these changing ideals of masculinity begin to take shape. So for those in the first generation, or those who are sort of at the heads of these forces now in Iran, many of them, up until Trump, everything that's happened since Trump is different, and I'll talk about that in a second, but up until Trump, I remember when the Iran nuclear deal was being negotiated, and once they were sort of getting close to the negotiations being finalized, there was all this hoopla in Washington. Will the IRGC agree to this? And I wrote an article at that point being like, of course they agree to this, because many of them, almost all of them, from that generation at least, are veterans of war. And if you talk to veterans of any war, pretty much many veterans of war will tell you that they don't want war, right? They've lived it, they've understood, and especially a war like the Iran-Iraq War, which was so close combat. And so many of them didn't, and they are thinking of their children. They want a country in which their children can live in a stable society. So within the Revolutionary Guard, when you talk to folks, either in the leadership or the rank and file, what they will tell you after a while is how much the debates with their children about what the Islamic Republic has become has changed their views about what they've done. Because their kids are growing up in society along with everyone else, going to school with other kids who are protesting in the streets against the Islamic Republic. They come home and they bring those critiques home to their parents, and these dads have to sit down and debate these kids. And so that begins to shift, but more than anything, those who have daughters, I heard them say over and over again, and it was interesting because I didn't notice this until the end of my research, but the ones who helped me the most were the ones who had daughters, because they would say things to me like the things that we supported at the beginning of the revolution when it came to gender laws at that time for us were abstract. But now that our daughters are coming up against all of these ceilings that we put into place, now we realize what we did. And we need to change those. And so oftentimes you heard that happening. And then as far as sort of masculinity writ large within the Revolutionary Guard and Basij and sort of ideal citizenship, it wanes and flows depending on what's going on geopolitically. Now that, well, ever since ISIS and definitely now, it's much more sort of this militant kind of ideal masculinity. But that wasn't always the case beforehand. Thank you for your questions. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Andrew Lynn. I'm not an anthropologist or in the international studies field, so this might be a slightly naive question.
No,
but I just
please.
wanted
Any
you
question
to,
is okay.
I study socioeconomic status in the States in a very different capacity, but I'm always kind of curious as how these sort of economic and class issues arise, and especially in the global world. So I'm curious, you spoke a little bit about the sort of what people here I think would argue is the American dream of the mobility of class, right, to the upper middle class. And I'm curious as how the sort of economic war, especially since the Trumpian politics have started, how the sort of economic sanctions might, I guess, sort of arise across these sort of gradients of pro-regime and anti-regime, and how that might pit people against one another.
Yeah, it's a great question. So pretty much from 1990 until 2008, Iran experienced more or less economic growth. With the implementation of the Obama-era sanctions is when Iran's economy really began to stagnate and then eventually began to come down. That poses quite a few problems. So within the general population, when you have a general population who's been used to better economic situations, and then all of a sudden that begins to stagnate, that causes certain anxieties. And now with the effects of the maximum pressure policy, this has even become worse. And that's part of the reason that we have all of these protests to the levels that we do. Prior to this downing of the airliner, the other ones were much more related to economics and class. This is also on purpose. Part of the maximum pressure policy, the way it was implemented was to target working class folks. In order to, because the idea, it comes from this regime change idea that Bolton and folks within the Trump administration had, where their goal was to instigate regime change from within by targeting working classes and then having them pour out onto the street and then eventually bring down the regime. So it's also not by accident that some of these things are taking place. At the same time, though, there's been a lot of economic mismanagement within the regime itself. So this is another place in which there's a lot of anger towards the elites in the political establishment in Iran for embezzling a lot of money. I mean, another thing that sanctions do, research has shown, and I know there are probably scholars in this room who've worked on these issues, but research has shown over and over again that sanctions only work on countries that you already have a relationship with, because then there's able to be negotiation and things to give and take. Sanctions do not work on countries where you don't have an economic any type of relationship with. This is why they haven't worked on Cuba. This is why they don't work on Iran. This is why they didn't work on Iraq prior to that. Work as far as like making the states that you are dealing with concede to certain things. They work in the sense of making lives very, very difficult for citizens on the ground, but they don't actually conduce any type of change. So when it comes to this, though, part of what sanctions do is that it creates a lot of black markets and gray markets in order to get around sanctions. And so what that ends up creating is a lot of embezzlement, a lot of corruption within states and things like that. And that's not to say corruption didn't already exist prior to this, but this exacerbates it a lot. And so part of what the regime is trying to do to counter this is they've begun through the judiciary branch cases to go after corruption. Many are saying that these are political and not necessarily actually for corruption. But it's leading to a very untenable situation. And so the Trump administration is trying to ramp up these pressures so much to cause something to happen before November 2020. And the Islamic Republic is trying to hold on in some ways. Now, just a few weeks ago, news came out that Iran is actually, for the first time since Trump imposed all of these sanctions against Iran's oil, basically trying to make it so that it can't sell oil anywhere, that in the past month, Iran's oil exports have actually gone up again. Because you're dealing with a regime that has been under sanctions in one way or another for 40 years. Just as they have learned how to fight back in a proxy style against the U.S. and Israel, they've also learned how to fight back economically. So it might not be a great fight back, but they are figuring out ways to keep the economic lifeline alive, and in their minds, they have to keep it alive at least until November. So who knows what happens by that point.
Hi, my name is Amber, and as a dual citizen myself of the U.S. and Turkey, I would love to hear more about your experiences of being a dual citizen, both in terms of how that affects your personal life and the idea of like where your loyalties lie, but also in terms of your work and how you feel like that influenced the approach you took in the way that you wrote and write about Iran and also about the U.S.
Okay, great. Thanks for your question. So part of this question, okay, so part of the reason I even, prior to doing the work on the chemical warfare survivors, I was terrified of these organizations, like terrified to the point when I would see some of these forces on the street, especially when we would go back for the summers and things like that, I would look the other way. I couldn't distinguish them all. All of them sort of melded into the same thing for me. And it wasn't until through sort of serendipity I ended up on this question of chemical weapons. And it was only then that I began to realize that, of course, there are differences in these communities, just like there are differences in any other community. Because I had been raised in a community of exiles who had suffered a lot after the revolution, because many of them, even though they fought for the revolution, sort of did not end up winning out, and then therefore were either put in prison or many of their friends and many of our close friends were executed and things like that. So because of that, there was a lot of personal feelings about what had happened, which were very valid. But those personal valid feelings also ended up concealing a lot about these different groups in Iran. And so as a dual national, it was really, for me, coming to this realization that many of the stories that I knew about the country of my origin were also being filtered in certain ways, and that that's not to say that those stories were not real, but that's also to say that that wasn't the whole picture. And so it took me a while to begin to sort of come to this point of being not only open to, but actively curious about these groups and these groups of men who had been demonized so much among certain groups of Iranians, as well as, of course, outside of the country, some for very good reasons, and other times also it was much more complicated. So when it came to doing this research, I think that was one of the things that I was trying to sort of grapple with the most. And then as far as, yeah, I mean, when I work on Iran now in DC and things like that, people will be like, oh, well, you know, you must be biased because you're Iranian, and fine, but we're not, our generation of dual nationals is not the first who've had to deal with these sorts of things. And so there's a lot of writing that we can, I think, find solace in and find strength in from folks who have done it before us. And it's a common trope, but it's not necessarily one that holds water. So push past it when you get it.
Hi, thank you, Doctor. I have a question about you navigating the publishing regime and just in general, how you've negotiated with your press, how you've negotiated with your editors, and what version of your story actually made it to being published.
Oh, great question. I was very, very fortunate to have editors at Stanford who, when I first turned in, so the book that I wrote is not like an academic book, for better or for worse. When I first turned in my first manuscript to the Stanford editors, one of them, the main editor, wrote me back, and I think she had read some of my other writing, and she said, look, this is fine, but if you want, you don't have to write in such academic strictness. Like, you can write how you want. And it was, although I must say at the time, this is when I was still here at Brown, I was 9 months pregnant when I got that email, and I just bawled. I thought like she had told me that we're not taking, I mean, I was just like a mess anyways. But anyway, after I calmed down and I realized she was actually giving me the green light to write the book how I wanted to and not how I thought it should be, because this is also my first academic book, and I need to get tenure and write in all of these sorts of things. And so I decided, okay, let me actually write this story in a way that these folks come to life. Like, let me write it in the way that I saw them, and have all of their complexities come out without flattening it with a lot of this sort of language that we tend to use, some for good reason, but some that I didn't want. And so I actually ended up writing the book that I wanted to write, and I didn't face any sort of censorship, and I think that I was lucky to do so. But yeah.
So looking back on the Green Movement in 2009 and then also the protests back in November, I was wondering how sustainable you think the regime's approach of handling protests are, which is just using brute force, surveillance and whatnot to instill a lot of fear and intimidation in the public.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that we've seen over the past, look, Syria changed a lot. Syria maybe changed everything in many ways, and not just for Syria, but for countries around the region. For those now at the top echelons of the Revolutionary Guard, and especially the paramilitary forces, they saw action in Syria. And so their understanding, and then it's important to understand how they see what happened in Syria, right, in order to understand what they're doing right now in Iran. What they saw from their perspective was that a popular uprising had the chance, or was, depending on who you talk to and when, had the opportunity to be taken advantage of by international players, including Israel, the United States, and others, and that they were going to use this as an opportunity to make Syria a failed state, or at least an opportunity to fight against and sort of instigate regime change against Syria, against Assad, in order to not allow a very important conduit of not only weapons to Hezbollah, which is standing against Israel on the southern border of Lebanon, but also in the wider geopolitics of the region, right? So for them, now, if you are in the Revolutionary Guard, what you know in the Revolutionary Guard is that you know you have fought basically a proxy war with the US for 8 years in the Iran-Iraq War, in which chemical warfare was used, chemical bombs were used in very large numbers, and no one did anything about it, and they knew exactly who was using it. And then, on top of that, later, you are then in a situation in which you understand that the US, once it invaded Iraq, they played out war games in which the next country to be attacked was going to be Iran. And they spent millions of dollars on war games, in which in all of these war games, especially the Millennial War Game, they end up losing, right, in that war game itself. It was as if the US was fighting Iran in this war game, and it ended up not going well for the US side. And so look up the Millennial Project if you're interested in this war game specifically. It's an interesting one to study. So they knew that they were going to be next, or at least the plan was for them to be next. And so it didn't work out in that way. And so anything that they see around the region is a potential opportunity to weaken all of these different forces. So from their perspective, what was happening in Syria was if Syria began to fail, then eventually, you know, Iran would be next as far as that is concerned. So in that atmosphere, what they saw and what they end up doing themselves in Iran in November of 2019, just a couple months ago, is that they see these protests as some of it being legitimate concerns, but much of it also having potential, as they call instigators that are being paid from the outside in them. And so for them, they are viewing everything in a warlike situation now. I mean, this is what's dangerous with the situation that we are in today, is that it's not about politics anymore. This is a war, right? I mean, from the Islamic Republic's perspective, they are in war with the US. And so when they see these kinds of uprisings, like in November, in which in some places there were the shooting did take place from the part of the protesters. And that's very odd in a place like Iran, because usually there aren't, only in some tribal areas are there guns, but not in other places around the country. And so for them, this is how it's starting. This is how it started in Syria. This is how it's starting. And so they clamped down with force. Now, the problem with that, though, is that people have very legitimate concerns, and they are killing lots of people indiscriminately. So what it ends up doing is it causes even more friction within the society, which is why even leaders within the paramilitary groups that I quoted to you all, began to say to their leaders, you are going to turn Iran into Syria. You need to be careful. It's not these protesters who are going to do it. And so this is where I think then, it's interesting that they couldn't really clamp down violently against the protesters in January. So we'll see what happens the next time protests happen. Protests are not irregular in Iran. It's not that they just started in this Trump moment either. They've been going on for a very long period of time. Protests will continue to happen. But now, I don't know what's going to, social scientists, we can't predict the future. If you talk to anyone who participated in the revolution in 1979, they will tell you we had no idea the revolution was going to succeed so quickly. You don't know, if you don't know what's going to happen, as long as I can remember, people have been talking about the fall of the regime in Iran, both here in the US and within Iran itself. And it's been there for 40 years now. So none of these things are things that we can necessarily predict or plan on or anything like that. But there are certain things that are in motion now that, I will say this as sort of an end to this, as an answer to this, but Iran, Khamenei is not going to leave the country like the Shah did. First of all, the political hierarchy of Iran has been sanctioned so much by the US from top to bottom that they can't even get on a plane and go anywhere. Right? So for practical purposes, they are entrenched in the country. Now, what that means is if this push towards regime change continues, then the only possible outcome of this would be civil war, because they're not going to get up and leave. Right? And they have shown that they will fight for power to stay, sort of like Assad did. And so for some, that is the goal. And I mean for some outside of the country, right? For some, that is the goal. Other than that, there doesn't seem to be much of a political solution at this moment, at least. I also don't know how much time I have, so you...
Maybe one more?
Sure, Tavi.
Two questions. Your book is fascinating from what you said. I haven't read it yet, but it seems to be full of human stories. Do you think there's a documentary in it? And my next question is, given the current tumultuous state of affairs, how do you think the anniversary of the revolution will play out on the streets of Tehran?
So I actually really wanted to film when I was doing the research, but since I was researching film producers, they know what can be done in the editing room, and of course they didn't allow me to film. So can there be something to come out of this? Maybe a fiction film. I don't see a narrative or a documentary film being made out of this. But as far as your last question about, remind me again, the anniversary of the revolution. So what's interesting about the anniversary of the revolution, which is coming up in February, which is always sort of put on by these big pro-regime marches and stuff, is that it's also the 40th day of Soleimani's death. And in Iranian, in the Shia calendar, that's really important when you mark 40 days after death, right? In the Islamic calendar. And so this is an important thing because Soleimani, again, as such a national hero who pulled out not just supporters of the regime, but also those who weren't necessarily supporters of the regime out, it's also going to be marking the 40th day after his death. So the two are colliding. For the regime, this is great. But what will actually end up happening, I don't know. I think it'll depend on a lot of things. There's also a lot of anger right now in Iran from the downing of the airliner. There's a lot of political infighting because there's parliamentary elections coming up in a few weeks as well, in a month as well. So a lot of things are happening, and there are a lot of moving parts. And that's the thing. I mean, Iranian politics, it's an authoritarian system, but it's an authoritarian system that has a lot of politics in it and a lot of contentious politics. And so it's not as easy as saying the supreme leader says this or, someone does that. There's a lot at play and a lot that's dynamic that we don't know what's going to happen between now and a few weeks from now.
Okay, with that, thank you very much, Narges.